Hello, my name is Eric Siegel and I am the Secretary of the South East Kent Trade Union Council, a member of Unite the Union and a member of the Socialist Party. The purpose of me talking today is to commemorate the ending of the poll tax and the Thatcher government some 30 years ago. I've co-written and compiled a book on behalf of the Trades Council called Couldn't Pay, Wouldn't Pay, Didn't Pay. And in that book, we explain the detailed and meticulous planning that went into the Kent Anti-Poll Tax Federation, who led the struggle in Kent against the poll tax. And together with the All Britain Federation, with a clear political leadership of Militant, the forerunner of the Socialist Party today, we defeated the poll tax and led to the demise of Thatcher, Prime Minister and the Tory government. Well, we live in unprecedented and tumultuous times at the moment. But the purpose of writing this book and speaking today is threefold. Firstly, it shows what we wanted to do and wanted to achieve some 30 years ago. 2, it shows what we did achieve. And 3, it explains what we want now. But for those of you who expect to hear a grizzled old political veteran reminiscing on old battles and times past, this talk will be disappointing. And for those of you who expect me to provide a clear roadmap, a shortcut to socialism, you'll also be disappointed. And for those of you who want to hear me say that we were wrong to stand by our clear socialist principles, that we should have compromised in our struggle against the Thatcher government, the poll tax, and then compromised again in defence of those self-same socialist principles against Neil Kinnock and Tony Blair, leaders of the Labour Party at that time, you'll be very disappointed. This was no idealistic battle plucked from the sky, but a fight based upon the desperate basic needs of working class families for shelter, food, clothing and heating. The community charge, or poll tax as it was called, was replaced the rates, a system of local taxation loosely based upon the size of the house and income. The poll tax, on the other hand, was a tax upon individuals, rich and poor. The poll tax was a wealth transfusion from the poor to the rich. Lord Clark, in his Saltwood Castle, not too far from where I'm sitting today, gained thousands of pounds, whilst a guy on the front of the book cover, Malcolm, and with his wife Pat and kids and his mum, faced bankruptcy and eviction from their homes due to Tory policies, and the poll tax would be the final straw, forcing families like Malcolm's to fight or to be forced onto the streets. There never was an alternative other than the working class fighting against the poll tax. But how was it possible that a government led by the so-called Iron Lady, elected with 102 majority, would be forced to resign 3 years after her election in 1987? The battle against the poll tax was the biggest campaign of civil disobedience of the 20th century. In the 1980s, magistrates' courts would normally see some 2 million cases in their courts a year. But in the 1990s, due to the poll tax campaign, to this figure was added a further 25 million cases of people refusing to pay the poll tax. In fact, the figure was 25,016,283, courtesy of the House of Commons Library. This involved some 14 million adults, 1/3 of the adult population of this country. And the legal system was unable to cope, and Thatcher's flagship policy collapsed, and she was forced to resign in November 1990. The question is, and it's very relevant and with parallels with today's government, how is it possible for a government with 102 majority and a strong leader to be defeated? Her defeat and the end of the poll tax was no accident, but it required detailed planning and organisation on a mass scale. The poll tax was introduced in Scotland in April 1989 and was to have the effect of channeling the anger of the working class against the Tories in response to the defeats that we'd suffered of the miners, the massive cuts in local services, unemployment, deindustrialisation, privatisation of utilities, the sale of council housing. A response, I have to say, that has parallels with the 2016 Brexit vote. The campaign against the poll tax, in fact, began in 1987, and as we say, forewarned is forearmed. It began in Edinburgh. In polls, 42% of the population in Scotland, 12 months before the poll tax was due to be introduced, were prepared not to pay. In fact, if you look at the Labour voters, it was actually 57%. In 1988, a conference of militant supporters agreed to launch the anti-poll tax campaign through the anti-poll tax unions across Scotland, with the slogan, "Don't pay, don't collect." And that slogan wasn't sucked out of the air. It was drawn from the experience of the anti-apartheid rent strikes in Soweto in South Africa, and from the Glasgow rent strikes during the First World War, when women who refused to pay an increase in their rents to their landlords whilst their menfolk were fighting in the Somme and so on. Anti-poll tax unions sprang up across Scotland, and by the end of 1989, 1 in 4 of the adult population in Scotland refused to pay. The vast majority of those supporting non-payment were working class Labour supporters. But the Labour Party, with honourable exceptions, restricted itself to opposing the poll tax through parliamentary speeches. They totally disregarded the history of the Labour movement, of mass struggle in fighting for the right to vote through the Chartists, the Tolpuddle martyrs. They forgot about the Poplar councillors, the Claycross councillors, and they forgot the slogan, "It's better to break the law than break the poor." And in particular, they ignored the magnificent struggle and lessons of the Liverpool councillors against Thatcher. We, however, had no qualms against building mass opposition to the poll tax, even if it meant breaking the law. And in England, we began the first steps in organising hundreds of tiny meetings across the country. In Folkestone, for example, 3 of us printed 300 leaflets by hand, and we gave them out in the town, and that resulted in a meeting in a hotel that's unfortunately closed now, of some 10 to 15 people. And the question at that meeting and at others was, how can we beat Thatcher? There's only a handful of us here. She beat the Argentinians over the Falklands, the NUM, the steelworkers, the P&O dispute. But we persevered and began to build. The anti-poll tax unions were built all over the country. Tiny little meetings, but they met regularly with minutes. And they came together as federations across the country. But this exploded in the Labour Party in the conference of 1989, when Christine McVicar, a delegate from Glasgow Shettleston Labour Party, tore up a poll tax payment book at the conference rostrum as she moved a resolution calling for Labour to back the mass campaign of non-payment. She defiantly declared to the conference, "Without the Tolpuddle trade unionists and the suffragettes breaking the law, we wouldn't be here at this conference. I'm ripping up my poll tax book, not as an individual, but as part of a mass non-payment of non-payment, as part of a mass campaign of non-payment." Unfortunately, we lost that proposition. But the next month, the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation met for the first time, bringing together some 2,000 delegates from anti-poll tax unions across the country. And protests began to grow. Hundreds and thousands demonstrated outside council offices in opposition to the poll tax. Mass demonstrations were organised by the Federation on March the 31st, 1990, the day before 35 million people were to receive their poll tax bills, and some 40,000 demonstrated peacefully in Glasgow, and 200,000 people attempted to demonstrate peacefully in London. The huge schism between how Labour and the trade union leadership were to respond was illustrated by a rally that the TUC held against the poll tax in a hall that could hold 3,000, but only 800 people turned up, mainly trade union officials and Labour Party dignitaries. As I said, the Glasgow demonstration was peaceful, but the London demonstration was disrupted due to the activities and strategy of political policing, and that led to some violent clashes between the police and some protesters. The media claimed that it was a riot, but for the tens of thousands of people that turned out to that, many of them who were on their coaches going home before they realised that there'd been violence provoked by the police, couldn't believe it. For us, it was a major success. However, a massive despite the patches of violence at that demonstration, a massive anti-Tory mood developed across the country, resulting in Labour having a 23% majority in the polls. However, Neil Kinnock squandered this lead through creating splits and divisions in the Labour Party by expelling Labour MPs Dave Nellist and Terry Fields and hundreds of ordinary members who were leading the anti-poll tax campaign, myself included. I'm still not allowed to join the Labour Party. By December, the Tories developed an 8% lead. However, in 1990, the campaign against the poll tax continued to grow and the struggle moved to the courts, where there were three stages. First, the liability orders issued by the council, second, the bailiffs, and third, prison. So the councils began to issue liability orders to those who hadn't paid. But the anti-poll tax unions came into their own and circulated clear guidance through leaflets and meetings on how to organise. These leaflets up here are the original ones, and on the back of them it gives clear and precise advice on what to do. The anti-poll tax unions, as I said, gave out hundreds of thousands of these leaflets, and the courts began to hear the cases of people in the courts. Initially, they were trying to go through blocks of lists of 500 at a time to get cleared out of the courts. But we challenged this and won. And then the courts had to hear each case on its merits. And this overwhelmed the legal system. And together at this time, we trained up people to be Mackenzie's friends. That is, people who weren't legally qualified, but were allowed to go in with someone who refused to pay and give them advice, give them a bit of support in the courts. Although this was challenged, but we did this all over the country. It wasn't the riots that defeated Thatcher and the poll tax. As I've said, it was meticulous planning, detailed organisation and mass non-payment welded together as the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation. The second legal step was seeing the bailiffs sent in. Once again, the anti-poll tax unions responded quickly, sending out detailed information on how to respond to the bailiffs. And we also organised mass pickets outside non-payers' homes to stop the bailiffs coming in. So in some areas, the bailiffs were terrified even to enter the villages in Dover, Aylsham, and others. They were just terrified, and this had a major political effect. For example, in Scotland, Tommy Sheridan, the chair of the Strathclyde Anti-Poll Tax Federation, who had been jailed for 6 months for attending a demonstration against the bailiffs, was elected as Glasgow City Councillor from his prison cell, and that just shows you the anger that was amongst Labour supporters. The third step was imprisonment, and the first person to be sentenced was a 74-year-old pensioner from Northampton who'd been a paratrooper on D-Day. But the News of the World, Murdoch's newspaper, sensitive as always to adverse publicity against the Tories, sent a cheque to pay the fine. In the first 18 months, 117 people were imprisoned for non-payment by 40 councils. 35 of those were militant supporters, including myself. I went to prison for a month. And Ruby Haddo and Jimmy Haddo and Anne herself from Kent. Ruby, in fact, was the first woman to be jailed, and she was sent to Holloway. The prosecuting counsel in her appeal was none other than that left-winger Sherry Blair, Tony Blair's wife. And I was told by Jimmy that she took Jimmy and Ruby into her office in the courtroom, berated them for daring to stand up and fight against the poll tax. 30 Labour MPs initially refused to pay, but Terry Fields MP from Broad Green was the only one to stand the test of time and was imprisoned in Walton Prison for some 58 days. Thousands demonstrated outside the prison to hear Scargill and Tony Benn demand his release. Tony Benn said the Labour leaders were more frightened of the anti-poll tax movement than the poll tax itself, and the expulsions began. Kinnock classified us as Toy Town revolutionaries, and following Terry's release from prison, Claire Short MP and Roy Hattersley MP proposed the expulsion from the Labour Party of Terry Fields MP and Dave Nellis. The Labour Party Young Socialists was shut down, which was the largest social democratic youth movement in Europe, and that was moved by Tom Watson, a name that you may recall, at the 1993 Labour Party conference. However, 8 months after the poll tax was introduced in England and Wales, on the 22nd of November 1990, I remember standing at Charing Cross Station, coming home from work, after hearing the news and seeing thousands of people getting their trains, rushing for their trains to go home, and realising that we touched the lives, the anti-poll tax unions had touched the lives of everyone there. But we saw Thatcher resigning, and Heseltine was then instructed to design an alternative to the poll tax, which was abolished on the 21st of March 1991. We'd won. So what are the lessons? Bob Crow, the late General Secretary of the RMT, who helped set up our Trades Council, gave our Trades Council a slogan: if you don't fight, you will lose, but if you fight, you may win. Organised mass struggle, pulling together those who were unable to pay with those unwilling to pay, led to victory. We refused to let individuals struggle on their own. I have to say that we would have won quicker if the leadership of the trade unions had supported the initial slogan of don't pay, don't collect. But we did win because the Tory government made two fundamental mistakes. One, rather than take on one section of the labour movement at a time, they took on the whole of the working class by making a tax that impoverished the mass of the working class. Two, the second reason was they mistook the timidity of the Labour Party and trade union leadership as representing the working class as a whole, roused en masse in struggle. I made a comment at the beginning. How could a government with a strong leader, with a large majority, be defeated within a short period of time? Marxists explain that election results are merely snapshots of the mood of the country on one day. Even governments with seemingly huge majorities can be removed, providing the working class are united and roused in anger together with a leadership that is prepared to fight and prepared to go the whole distance and win. Thank you very much. Please share this and discuss it. Bye.